That unsounded ocean you gasp in is life. Those sharks, your foes. Those spades, your friends. And what between sharks and spades, you are in a sad pickle and peril. Poor lad. You seriously can't tell me that that doesn't belong on some like academic Pinterest board or some Tumblr post. That one's a good one. That one's right up there with Live, Laugh, Love. What's up guys, it's the host, you're watching The Gray Medium, and today I am going to be covering part 3 of my series on Herman Melville's Moby Dick. If you're interested in checking out parts 1 or parts 2 of the series I'm making on Herman Melville's Moby Dick, I'll make sure to have those linked down in the description down below, as well as with the 4th and the 5th part when those come out as well. This book is absolutely huge, and there's no way I could truly do it justice with one video, so I decided to split the book up into 5 parts. Each video, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, will cover 25 chapters, so 1 covered chapters 1 through 25, 2 covered 26 through 50, and this video, video number 3, is going to cover 51 through 75. For each video, I'm just going to select 5 chapters from that range that I found to be really important, and I'm going to make sure to have all 5 of those linked in the description down below, so if you guys want to skip ahead to any chapter, go ahead and check out the links in the description down below as well. But for today's video, I'm going to go ahead and cover 5 chapters, starting with chapter 52, The Albatross. Right after that, I have chapter 55, Of the Monstrous Pictures of Whales, chapter 60, The Line, chapter 64, Stubb's Supper, and chapter 72, The Monkey Rope. And if you're new to The Gray Medium, this is the channel where I'm constantly trying to find the balance between black and white. That is gray. What that means to me is trying to find the balance between both mind and body. So regardless of if I'm in the gym lifting weights or if I'm in the library reading books, I'm always trying to do something to improve upon my mind or my body. So if you're interested in checking out another academic related video, I'll go ahead and I'll link one right here. And if you're interested in checking out an athletic video, I'll make sure to link one right here. Both of these videos will be linked in the description down below. That being said though, let's go ahead, let's hop right back into Herman Melville's Moby Dick. So the first chapter in this middle 5th of the book that really stood out to me was chapter 52, The Albatross. So The Albatross is obviously a friendly nod to the works of Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He wrote a poem called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And if you're unfamiliar with that poem, I had to study it in undergrad. This Ancient Mariner is essentially warning these people of how it is that he killed an albatross. He killed a bird. There was if I remember correctly, there's just a bird, a harmless bird, an innocent bird that he killed, and essentially he preyed on an innocent life. And the whole moral of that story was that this ancient mariner being haunted by the fact that he killed an innocent life just for no real good reason. And I feel like having that background and understanding Coleridge Taylor's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner kind of provides a backdrop to chapter 52 when you turn that page and you see that the chapter is titled The Albatross, and Melville does a really good job of matching that poem's intensity here in this chapter. So essentially, while they're sailing, the Pequod comes across another ship that's visibly damaged, it's visibly run down, and the text describes them to be close enough to one another to where they could quite literally jump from one masthead to another. It's at this point that, for obvious reasons, the members of the Pequod, including Captain Ahab, want to communicate with this other ship. They want to ask this other ship if they have seen or heard of anything of Moby Dick. And the text gets a little bit spooky here on the bottom of page 257 as this text reads over onto the top of page 258. The page reads, "But as the strange captain, leaning over the pallid bulwarks, was in the act of putting his trumpet to his mouth, it somehow fell from his hand into the sea. And the wind now rising amain, he in vain strove to make himself heard without it. Meanwhile his ship was still increasing the distance between. While in various silent ways the seamen of the Pequod were evincing their observance of this ominous incident at the first mere mention of the white whale's name to another ship. Ahab for a moment paused. It almost seemed as though he would have lowered a boat to board the stranger had not the threatening wind forbade." Essentially what happened is that they tried to ask the other members of the ship about Moby Dick, and the minute that this other captain tried to raise his trumpet to his mouth to communicate with them, he dropped it and it fell in the ocean. which is almost pointing to this fact that Herman Melville doesn't want Moby Dick to be talked about, almost as if the legend of Moby Dick cannot be talked about. It almost makes me think about, he who shall not be named. It almost makes me think of Voldemort in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. Moby Dick is really amongst these sailors immortalized, and throughout the legends of Moby Dick, he's really, made into this myth and this supernatural being that people can barely even talk about when they're out at sea, which is pretty freaking funny. And this kind of subverts what happens within the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, where this Ancient Mariner is obliged and he's obligated to talk about having killed this innocent bird. It's almost as if this other ship, ran down and as rugged as it is, has fallen victim to the wrath of Moby Dick. It's almost as if they've lived to tell the tale, or in this case, they've lived to not tell the tale. And reading a chapter like this, at this point in the book, where you're about halfway through, a little bit less than halfway through, it's really building up the suspense, and it's really making you, as a reader, fear Moby Dick as well. The whole meaning of this chapter is a little bit arbitrary and hard to make out, especially because it makes such a sharp turn. It really makes like a really sharp 90-degree turn here at the bottom of page 258, leading on to the end of page 259. The chapter ends right here as it reads, "Were this world an endless plain, and by sailing eastward we could forever reach new distances and discover sights more sweet and strange than any Cyclades or islands of King Solomon. Then there were promise in the voyage, but in pursuit of those far mysteries we dream of, or in tormented chase of that demon phantom that, sometime or other, swims before all human hearts, while chasing such over this round globe, they either lead us on in barren mazes, or midway leave us whelmed." Essentially, what I made out there is that Ishmael is kind of pointing to this fact, or at least I'm assuming it's Ishmael who's speaking here. Ishmael is kind of pointing to this fact that sailing around a sphere, sailing around this globe, there is really no set start and finish line. It's not like this, like the Earth is flat and infinite and like it's going on forever. Ultimately, there is something that is kind of redundant. There is something that is kind of tedious and is a little bit slightly insane, just continuing to spin your wheels, going in a circle around this globe, knowing that ultimately you're going to end up back where you started. And when you look at a physical journey, and you look at the fact that the actual distance traveled will ultimately bring you back to where you started, then you really start to recognize that it's less about the physical distance covered, considering that once you hit that halfway point, once you're halfway around the globe, you're ultimately just getting closer to where you started, which really points to the fact that this is a metaphysical, a mental, emotional, a spiritual journey rather than a physical one. And I think that with the commentary on wishing that the world was infinite rather than finite really points to this fact that Ishmael, or whoever's writing this for that case, really does, seek this constant pursuit of the expansion of his mind. The next chapter I wanted to jump into was chapter 55 of the Monstrous Pictures of Whales. As I've mentioned so far in my videos discussing Moby Dick, the story essentially steps in and out of this pursuit of the white whale. There will be some chapters that will remove you entirely from the actual ship, the actual voyage on the Pequod. Those chapters will really just give you random facts or different stories about whaling in general, which really add to the world building that Herman Melville is creating around the Pequod. This chapter, chapter 55, is a perfect example of one of those because it really is just an entire chapter in which Ishmael, or the narrator for that case, really just begins to talk about how terribly artists depict whales in their drawings and in their paintings. A perfect example of how terrible they get the scale wrong on their drawings and on their paintings of whales is provided here on page 287. The text reads, "Let me say that it has an eye which applied according to the accompanying scale to a full-grown sperm whale would make the eye of the whale a bow window some 5 feet long. Ah, my gallant captain, why did ye not give us Jonah looking out of that eye?" Essentially, what the text is poking fun at here is the fact that the scale of the eye of this whale was severely off. So if you were to actually scale that painting up to the size of a real whale, the eye would literally be 5 feet long. It would be like a porthole on a submarine. Jonah, while inside of the whale, would quite literally be able to look out of it, standing behind it in his entirety. So that quote was really poking fun at the fact that, in a literal sense, artists don't accurately depict whales in their drawings and in their paintings. And on the next page, 288, the text goes on to explain how a lot of artists will then go on to draw pictures of whales, or sperm whales to be more specifically, based off of the dead carcasses of these whales. They have a dead model of the whale, and that's what they're modeling their artwork after. That's what they're using as their reference. But the major flaw in taking that approach towards trying to artistically represent these whales is the fact that that would be similar to drawing a wrecked ship, or drawing a person, or an animal for that matter, based off of what their skeleton looks like. The living whale is so different than the dead whale, and you cannot capture the whale in its entirety. You cannot capture the whale truly if your reference is a dead whale. And for that reason, the text continues here on page 289, when the text reads, "For all these reasons, then, any way you may look at it, you must needs conclude that the great Leviathan is that one creature in the world which must remain unpainted to the last." A few lines later, the text continues, "And the only mode in which you can derive even a tolerable idea of this living contour is by going a-whaling yourself. But by so doing, you run no small risk of being eternally stove and sunk by him. Wherefore, it seems to me you had best not be too fastidious in your curiosity touching this Leviathan." So, on the surface level, the Moby Dick haters are obviously going to say that this page, or this chapter rather, is a waste of a few pages simply talking about how inaccurate these depictions of whales are. But what Melville is really nodding at here is that the white whale and what the white whale stands for cannot be artificially recreated or artificially represented. In the case of Ahab, what the white whale means to him can't be explained. He can't tell you what the white whale means to him. He could only show you. In the case of Ishmael, he can't tell you what the white whale is to him. He could only show you. Whales as a whole are symbolically and allegorically representative of different things depending on what character we're viewing them through. If we're viewing whales through the lens of Ahab versus if we're viewing whales through the lens of Stubb versus if we're viewing whales through the lens of Queequeg, all of these different characters depict whales in different ways. They all view whales in a different worldview, really. So for someone to try to draw a picture of a whale, well, yeah, literally, they can't do a good job, but figuratively and metaphorically, you can't just try to tell someone what your white whale is. That's something that is, mutually exclusive to you and the whale. Ultimately, this is a relationship that you have with the whale, and it's a relationship that you alone have with the whale. And for that last quote to really touch up on the fact that if you want to accurately see a whale, you have to actually go out to see one live with your own two eyes, it's really a statement on the fact that if you do really want to confront things that bother you, or if you do really want to approach these concepts that really resonate with you individually, you can't try to portray that to someone else. That is a unique relationship that you are going to have individually. And for that reason, I feel like chapters like this one, which kind of take a step back from the actual, narrative of being on a ship trying to kill this whale, really do add to the world building of the book in its entirety. And I do think that these type of chapters really do make Moby Dick so great. But enough about that. Let's go ahead, let's talk about the next chapter. So obviously leave it to Melville to spend multiple pages talking about the physical differences between one piece of rope and another. I mean, I enjoy it. I'm a Melville fan, but I could get what all the Melville critics, what all the people who are really, critical of Melville are saying. This is one of those chapters where he is going to beat you to death with the physical differences between one piece of rope and another. But it's not without good reason. Here on page 302, Melville says it plain and simple. "I have here to speak of the magical, sometimes horrible, whale line." So the whale line is obviously described as both magical and horrible, and the whale line itself is both peaceful and essential to all things whaling. Nothing gets done without it, but it's also simultaneously dangerous and hazardous to all things living, including the men who are using it. This chapter goes on to talk about how it's impossible to catch whales, and it's impossible to go whaling without the whale line, And that's what this chapter's title, The Line, is referring to. And you need this line in order to, you need its utility to go whaling. However, this line is so strong, and in these tense situations where people are panicking and working quickly, it could actually end up killing men on board the ship. This is talked about here on the next page, page 304. The text reads, "As the least tangle or kink in the coiling wood, in running out, infallibly take someone's arm, leg, or entire body off. The utmost precaution is used in stowing the line in its tub." And following up on the next page, page 305, the text continues talking about the dangers of this line when it reads, "Perhaps a very little thought will now enable you to account for those repeated whaling disasters, some few of which are casually chronicled, of this man or that man being taken out of the boat by the line and lost. For when the line is darting out, to be seated then in the boat is like being seated in the midst of the manifold whizzings of a steam engine in full play, when every flying beam and shaft and wheel is grazing you." So if this whale line is attached to a whale that storms off, if it starts swimming away, this rope is going to rapidly uncoil. It's going to unravel out of its tub at a high speed, and depending on what direction this whale line is being pulled from, this line, which is immensely strong, and it's only about 3/4 of an inch thick, I believe the text described it to be, but this pretty small in diameter line is moving, and it's extremely strong, by the way. It's moving at high speeds, and it's capable of decapitating dudes as they're walking across the ship's deck. So there's a duality here. This line provides utility, but it also can cause countless fatalities accidentally. I like what's said here later on the same page, page 306. The text reads, "The calm is but the wrapper and the envelope of the storm, and contains it in itself, as the seemingly harmless rifle holds the fatal powder, and the ball, and the explosion. So the graceful repose of the line, as it silently serpentines about the oarsman before being brought into actual play. This is a thing which carries more of true terror than any other aspect of this dangerous affair. But why say more? All men live enveloped in whale lines. All are born with halters round their necks. But it is only when caught in the swift, sudden turn of death that mortals realize the silent, subtle, ever-present perils of life." And a big part of what this chapter is really pointing at is essentially this idea that there's a lot of things. Obviously the analogy was made to the rifle, but there's a lot of things that are inanimate objects. They're things that we use in our daily lives. They're things that provide us utility. You could use a fire to keep yourself from freezing to death. You could use a fire to cook food to feed the hungry, but you could also use fire to burn down buildings and to kill. You could use a knife to, prepare food, to cut carrots on a cutting board, but you could also use a knife to kill. And that's really what this chapter is getting at with the whale line. It's essentially pointing out that some of the tools that provide us the most utility double as the weapons that bring us the most fatality. I think that's really reflective of a lot of the things that are on this boat, that are on the Pequod. Ultimately, the direction that this voyage goes on, the outcome that they get is in large part up to how it is that they use their resources. And it really makes you realize how absolutely metal it is to be, out trying to hunt whales, to be out on a whaling voyage. And I think the cherry on top with this chapter is actually the next chapter. In the following chapter, there's a scene where they're hunting a whale, they're whaling, and the line gets mentioned in passing. And if you read this chapter, chapter 60, and then right after it you're reading chapter 61, it clicks. It's great. If you read chapter 60 and then you put the book down for a week and you come back and read chapter 61, it might not have the same effect, but this chapter provides that context of the line, and then in the next chapter, chapter 61, you get those two words, the line, and you immediately know what's being talked about there, and it adds to the intensity of that scene. So I really do recommend reading chapter 60 and then chapter 61 right afterwards. Even though it's a short-lived moment, it's literally 2 words in chapter 60. Getting to really, reap the rewards of reading this chapter and then seeing it play out in the next chapter is a lot of fun. So the next chapter that I really wanted to touch up on was chapter number 64, Stubb's Supper. So obviously, if you haven't seen any of the other videos, you don't know who Stubb is. Stubb is one of the 3 chief mates that have been hired under Captain Ahab. So essentially, underneath the captain, Captain Ahab, there's 3 different men who essentially are like the leaders or the shot callers, the play callers, the guys who are kind of in charge of what's going on the ship's deck. One of those three is Stubb. At this point in the book, they've already killed a sperm whale, and at this point, the Pequod is essentially towing this sperm whale alongside the ship, and it's essentially pulling this whale alongside the ship because the whale is too heavy to actually pull up onto the boat. So they have a hook which pulls this whale alongside them in the ocean next to them as they are, sailing along on their voyage. And it's at this point that they are now harvesting meat from the whale. They're harvesting the blubber to make oil, to burn, to have light for their lamps, but they're also harvesting the meat off of this whale so that they could have whale steaks, so that they could have fresh food to eat. Mind you, when you're on a ship like this, you can't really pack fresh food. Everything has to be able to last a long time, so the only fresh food they're really getting is the fresh seafood, like the whale steaks that they could get when they kill a sperm whale. So essentially at this point, there is a black man on the ship who has been designated the task of being the ship's cook. He's cooking and preparing these whale steaks, and obviously all of the men who just helped hunt this whale are now getting fed accordingly. And similar to a chapter that I had mentioned in an earlier part, where I was essentially discussing how Queequeg had talked about the behavior of the cannibals from the island he is from versus the Christians on the ships that he is now sailing on, we get a really interesting conversation here. We get a really interesting commentary here on the differences between dogs, sitting below a table while meat is getting carved, waiting to catch the scraps that fall down. The similarities between them and sharks swimming around this dead whale in the ocean, ready to start taking bites out of this dead whale. And again, the similarities and differences between those two groups, and even the men on this ship who are looking to hunt and kill whales themselves. There's a quote here on page 319 that reads, "Sharks will be seen longingly gazing up to the ship's decks, like hungry dogs round a table where red meat is being carved, ready to bolt down every killed man that is tossed to them. And though, while the valiant butchers over the deck table are thus cannibally carving each other's live meat with carving knives all gilded and tasseled, the sharks, also, with their jewel-hilted mouths, are quarrelsomely carving away under the table at the dead meat, and though, were you to turn the whole affair upside down, it would still be pretty much the same thing. That is to say, a shocking, sharkish business enough for all parties. And though sharks are the invariable outriders of all slave ships crossing the Atlantic, systematically trotting alongside to be handy in case a parcel is to be carried anywhere or a dead slave to be decently buried." So essentially what this quote is pointing at is the fact that man, shark, dog, regardless, they all share that same feral desire to feed. They all have their mouths salivate at the sight of meat. And when it makes that comment here about if you were to turn the whole affair upside down, it would still be pretty much the same thing, it's essentially pointing to the fact that man, as civilized and as domesticated as he tries to present himself to be, still has the feral desires to feed and to kill that a dog or a shark would have as well. And this is making a really interesting comment here on the actual morality and the actual ethics of sailors in relation to the ethics or the morality of sharks or dogs. Stubb can stand tall and puff his chest, and he could claim to, have a moral or a ethical or a conscious superiority over these sharks that are acting like animals, but he himself is yelling at this chef who he obviously has some racial ideologies projected onto this chef. He assumes himself to not only be superior over the chef because he is higher up in the social economic hierarchy that exists within this boat, but he also perceives himself to be higher up above the chef because he is presumably white and the chef is black. So Stubb, in that regard, he really does have a very animalistic, a very feral, very evil worldview on a lot of things. And it's funny because he actually complains and demands that his whale steak is too overdone and he wants it more rare, the same way that a dog or a shark eats rare meat. Stubb is, despite having conscious thought process, despite having the ability to critically think, He really is animalistic in his desires, and he's representative of a lot of people who still think that way. Stubb as a character is pretty frickin' ignorant, and he's really interesting to learn from in that regard. And he's one of those characters who, in this stretch of the book, from chapters 51 to 75, we get to see a lot of, and I think that's really valuable at this point in the novel. Ultimately, Stubb, and a lot of men like him, denounce these sharks for their ravenous behavior, despite, knowing it or not, knowingly or unknowingly, demonstrating those same behaviors himself. The final chapter I want to discuss in this part, and without a doubt my favorite chapter of this part, part 3, it might be one of my top 3 to top 5 favorite chapters in the entire book so far, is chapter 72, The Monkey Rope. So in this chapter, it's explained how now that they have killed their sperm whale, and now that they have this sperm whale essentially being towed alongside the Pequod in the water, they're beginning to harvest the blubber off of this whale. They're beginning to harvest the meat off of this whale. They're, really reaping the fruits of their labor now. They're reaping what they sow, in the sense that they can now harvest meat and blubber off of this freshly killed whale. But obviously some hard work goes into not only killing the whale, but now that the whale is dead, actually harvesting its products. So they pick a man. At this point, if there's any question on who that man that they pick is to jump in the water and to help them harvest this meat, then you probably haven't been paying attention, but they pick Queequeg. One way or another, Queequeg ends up jumping in the water, and he is essentially floating in the water, holding on to this dead whale, and he is, helping rotate the whale. They're throwing hooks down to him. He's helping hook these hooks into the whale's flesh. They needed a sailor to go jump down into the water and to essentially help them cut up and to help harvest the products off of this whale, and that happened to be Queequeg. Now, this is where the question is asked, okay, the monkey rope, what is the monkey rope? The monkey rope is essentially a rope that is attached to Queequeg's belt. Queequeg is described to be wearing a canvas belt, and one end of this monkey rope is tied to his canvas belt. So ultimately, you got to imagine that if anything is to happen, let's say he is to drown, or if the emergency is to take place while he's in the water, at least he's tied off on a rope. Maybe they can pull him back in. That is until you start to see this monkey rope and you start to see where the other end of it is tied off. The horror and the real just daylight terror of having to float on a dead whale in the middle of the ocean is really described well by Ishmael, who's standing on the deck's surface. He's explaining how sharks can smell a drop of blood from miles away, and when you're floating on a giant piece of dead whale that is bleeding rapidly outward in all directions, you're a huge piece of shark bait. So Queequeg is in this freezing cold water, he's visibly shivering, and he's working his tail off trying to harvest this meat, but at the end of the day, he's floating in a giant puddle of blood in the middle of the ocean, and there's sharks nearby. Queequeg is in an immense amount of immediate danger, and Ishmael is sitting here on the deck kind of looking at him like, geez, I would hate to be that guy. And that is until the book slowly and subtly explains that the other end of that monkey rope that is tied off on one end on the canvas belt that is on Queequeg, the other end of that monkey rope is tied off on a leather belt that is around the waist of Ishmael. So Ishmael initially is almost dissociated from the entire situation, in the sense that he's looking down off of the deck surface and he's looking at Queequeg and he's like, man, must suck to be that guy. But then the terror and the horror of Ishmael realizing, like, oh shoot, when a wave brings Queequeg down under the Earth's surface a little bit, that rope tugs on him, it almost pulls him overboard. When Queequeg struggles a little bit, that rope pulls on him as well. Ishmael eventually begins to recognize that, hey look, if Queequeg is to sink to the bottom of the ocean, I am most certainly following this guy down to Davy Jones' locker. And that terror is explained really well here on page 349. The text reads, "So that, for better or for worse, we two, for the time, were welded. And should poor Queequeg sink to rise no more, then both usage and honor demanded, that instead of cutting the cord, it should drag me down in his wake. So then, an elongated Siamese ligature united us. Queequeg was my own inseparable twin brother. Nor could I in any way get rid of the dangerous liabilities which the hempen bond entailed." And this quote continues on the next paragraph on the same page. The text reads, "So strongly and metaphysically did I conceive of my situation then, that while earnestly watching his motions, I seemed distinctly to perceive that my own individuality was now merged in a joint stock company of the two. My free will had received a mortal wound, and that another's mistake or misfortune might plunge innocent me into unmerited disaster or death. And to rub salt in the wound, just a couple paragraphs later on the next page, the text reads, "Nor could I possibly forget that, do what I would, I only had the management of one end of it." Essentially what we're recognizing here is not only a super terrifying scene of realizing that Ishmael might drown as a result of Queequeg's suffering, but it's also a pretty interesting commentary on free will versus determinism. And reading this chapter, initially it feels like one of those chapters that's really part of the A storyline. It feels like something that is talking about, a bunch of dudes on a boat trying to hunt a whale. But rereading this chapter a second or a third time, writing this script for this video, I recognized that I would really put this chapter more in the B storyline or more in the world building category of chapters that Herman Melville includes, because you don't actually get an end to it. This scene of terror is described, and then the next chapter just goes on as usual, and nothing is actually talked about as to what happened to Queequeg or how that whole situation ended. It was just, here's this absolutely terrifying situation, and then the page ends, and the next chapter starts, and it's just, it's another day on the boat. Really, this chapter doesn't chronologically fit into the story that well at all, and it really does make me think that it is more of a philosophical reflection on free will versus determinism than it is an actual plot point within this story that's being told within this book. This monkey rope is really representative of the fact that Ishmael, to a certain extent, can't really control his own fate. And regardless of what it is that you think you can control, there probably is some factors that are almost entirely in your control. You can choose to act out certain things the way you want to act them out. There is still a multivariable equation of seemingly endless variables that you can't control. You can't control if it's going to rain or not. You can't control if the sun's going to shine or not. There are things that are ultimately out of your control that you can't change. And being out at sea is a constant reminder of that to Ishmael. The fact of the matter is that the ocean is going to do what it wants with you, and it's your obligation, if you want to survive, simply to adjust to what the ocean is doing. You're not going to overcome the ocean. There's no way that you are stronger than it or that you're going to overpower it, and this monkey rope is a constant reminder of that. No matter what Ishmael does on this deck surface, if Queequeg gets eaten by a shark, chances are Ishmael is too. If Queequeg sinks to the bottom of the ocean, then chances are Ishmael is going to as well. This rope creating this physical bond between Ishmael and Queequeg is really creating this metaphysical or this metaphorical or this symbolic bond between Ishmael and his humanity, between Ishmael and his ultimate fate. And it's important to mention that on that last quote I read, there's an asterisk. You look down in the footnotes, the asterisk explains that, traditionally speaking, and I could trust this fact check because Herman Melville was a real sailor himself, this little asterisk in the footnote points out the fact that there were monkey ropes on whaling vessels at this time, but the other end of the monkey rope wasn't tied off to a man who is on the deck. It was tied off to the ship itself, which makes a lot more logical sense. However, this footnote explains that Stubb demanded or set up that the monkey rope must be tied off to Ishmael. So it's really interesting because we know already at this point in the book that Captain Ahab is completely nuts, but now we're recognizing that Stubb's absolute insanity is definitely downstream of Ahab's insanity as well, because in any other circumstances, on any other ship, that monkey rope would be tied off to Queequeg and then be tied off to the boat, not be tied off to Ishmael, putting another man's life in immediate danger. So that's interesting to reflect on too. Anyways, that's all I really got for you guys today. I'm gonna go ahead and read chapters 76 through 100 now, and then I'm gonna go ahead and bring you guys part 4. So if you're interested in checking out parts 1, 2, 4, or 5, I'm gonna make sure to have all 4 of those videos linked in the description down below. And like I said earlier, if you're interested in checking out another mind or another body video, both of these videos will be linked in the description down below as well. And of course, I appreciate you greatly if you've made it this far in the video. Please leave a like if you enjoyed, leave a comment down below to start a discussion, and of course, subscribe if you're new. Until next time, I'm the host, You're watching The Gray Medium. Stay gray.